It was the kind of summer that felt like it could change everything. The air was thick with possibility, the days stretched long and golden, and for once, I actually felt like something exciting might finally happen to me. I wasn't the most popular kid, didn't have a huge group of friends or much going on, really. But when my uncle called and said his friend Daniel wanted to take me on a weekend trip, something inside me lit up. It felt like being chosen. Like maybe, just maybe, I mattered enough to someone to be invited on an adventure. I packed my bag with quiet excitement, not knowing that by the end of that trip, I'd come back a different person, one who no longer trusted so easily, one who carried a secret too heavy to share. What started as a chance to feel special turned into something I spent years trying to forget, but never could. Profile. Quen 3 to 235 BA22B. 5:59 p.m. Absolutely. Below is the full 6-chapter story script in continuous paragraph form, with no headings, no line breaks, just flowing storytelling designed for a faceless YouTube video. The chapters are seamlessly connected and written in natural, emotional English to engage viewers from start to finish. It was the summer before my last year of high school when everything changed, or at least that's how it feels now when I look back on it all. I wasn't the most popular kid in school, not by a long shot. I kept mostly to myself, spent a lot of time reading or just wandering around town alone, trying to figure out who I was and where I fit in. My family wasn't exactly close either. We weren't one of those families that ate dinner together every night or went on weekend trips. We were more like ships passing in the night, polite but distant, always caught up in our own lives. Still, there were a few people I respected, even if I didn't talk to them much. One of them was my uncle. He was the older brother of my mom, the kind of guy who always seemed to know what to say without making you feel uncomfortable. He had this quiet confidence about him, the kind that made you feel like he saw things other people didn't. I wouldn't say we were best friends or anything like that, but I liked him. He never treated me like a kid, which I appreciated. One afternoon, right after school ended, I was sitting in my room scrolling through my phone when my mom called me downstairs. She looked a little excited, which was unusual for her, so I knew something was up. "Your uncle called," she said, handing me a glass of water like it was some big moment. "He wants you to go on a trip with his friend Daniel." I remember blinking at her like I hadn't heard right. A trip with my uncle's friend. That didn't make any sense. I barely knew this guy. From what I'd seen, Daniel was a little older than my uncle, maybe late 30s or early 40s, and he always seemed different. Not bad different, just hard to read. He smiled a lot, asked questions about my life, and always remembered small details, which felt nice but also kind of strange. I couldn't quite put my finger on why, but something about him made me a little uneasy. Still, my mom was pushing for it. She said it would be good for me to get out of the house, do something fun for once instead of just staying cooped up all summer. And honestly, part of me wanted to go. Not because I was excited about spending time with Daniel, but because I wanted to feel like someone thought I mattered. I wanted to believe that my uncle had chosen me for a reason, that I was special enough to be invited on this trip. So I said yes, even though a small voice in the back of my head told me not to. The plan was simple, a weekend road trip to a cabin in the mountains. Just me and Daniel. My uncle would drop us off and come pick us up 2 days later. There was no real explanation for why it was just the two of us. When I asked, my uncle just laughed and said, "You'll have fun, trust me. Daniel's a good guy." That should have been a red flag, but I ignored it. Maybe I didn't want to see it for what it was. When the day finally came, I packed a small bag and waited outside for Daniel to show up. He pulled into the driveway in a black SUV that looked way too clean for someone who was supposedly going camping. He stepped out wearing sunglasses and a soft smile, like he already knew me better than I knew myself. "Hey there," he said, opening the passenger door for me like I was some kind of guest. I gave him a small wave and climbed in, feeling awkward as my uncle waved goodbye from the porch. The drive started off normal enough. We talked about music, movies, and school. Daniel asked me about my interests, my dreams, the kinds of things adults usually ask kids they don't really know. But there was something about the way he listened, too intense, too focused. Like he was trying to memorize every word I said. I tried to shrug it off. Maybe he was just being friendly. As we drove further away from the city, the scenery changed. Tall trees lined the roads, the air got cooler, and the noise of traffic faded into silence. I remember looking out the window and thinking how peaceful it all was, how far away from everything I felt. But then Daniel started asking more personal questions, about my parents, my relationships, whether I ever felt lonely. At first, I answered politely, but soon I realized I didn't want to keep talking. The more he asked, the more I felt like I was being studied, like I was some kind of puzzle he was trying to solve. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was starting to set behind the trees, casting long shadows across the dirt path leading up to the front door. It was isolated, no neighbors, no lights, just the sound of wind rustling through the leaves. Daniel unlocked the door and stepped inside like he owned the place, leaving me standing there for a second, staring at the wooden steps. I took a deep breath and followed him in, not knowing that this weekend would change the way I saw the world forever. I didn't realize it yet, but I was already trapped. Not physically, not yet, but emotionally. Because even then, in that quiet cabin surrounded by trees, I could feel something shifting inside me. Something I couldn't explain, something I didn't know how to fight. The air inside the cabin was cool, almost too cold compared to the warm summer day we'd just left behind. Daniel flipped on a small lamp near the couch and tossed his keys onto a wooden table with a soft clink. "Home sweet home," he said with a grin, like this place meant something to him. I didn't respond. I just stood there for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light, taking in the rustic furniture, the smell of pine wood, and the quiet that settled around us like a heavy blanket. It felt peaceful at first, but also strange, like we were the only two people left in the world. He started unpacking our bags while I stood awkwardly by the door, not sure what to do with myself. Eventually, I wandered over to one of the windows and looked out at the trees stretching endlessly into the distance. There was no sign of life out there, no lights, no movement, just the wind brushing through the leaves like it had been doing for centuries. Daniel walked up behind me and placed a hand lightly on my shoulder. "You okay?" he asked. His voice was soft, almost concerned. I nodded without turning around, not trusting myself to speak. He let his hand linger for a second before stepping back and saying, "Come on, let's get some food in you." We ended up making sandwiches together in the tiny kitchen. The silence between us broken only by the sound of bread being sliced and the occasional question from Daniel about school or my favorite bands. He listened intently, nodding along as if everything I said mattered more than anything else in the world. I found myself opening up more than I intended to, telling him things I hadn't even told my closest friends. He laughed at all the right moments, smiled when I hesitated, made me feel like I was important. And maybe I was imagining it, but sometimes it felt like he leaned in a little too close when I spoke, like he wanted to catch every word before it disappeared into the air. That night, we sat outside on the porch steps, wrapped in blankets because the mountain air had gotten colder once the sun went down. The sky was clear, filled with stars that seemed closer than they ever did back home. Daniel lit a cigarette and offered me one, but I declined. He didn't push me. Instead, he just sat there quietly for a while before asking, "Do you ever feel like you don't really belong anywhere?" I looked at him, surprised by the question. He wasn't looking at me, he was staring off into the darkness, the glow of his cigarette flickering with each inhale. I thought about how to answer. "Sometimes," I finally said. He nodded like he understood. "I used to feel like that all the time," he admitted. Like I was different, like I didn't fit in. "You know what helped?" I shook my head. "Finding people who saw me for who I really was," he said. Then he turned to look at me, holding my gaze longer than felt comfortable. "People like you." I didn't know what to say to that. My heart was pounding for reasons I couldn't explain. I wanted to believe it was just friendly conversation, but something about the way he said it made me uneasy. I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders and looked away, pretending to be fascinated by the shadows dancing across the trees. He didn't seem to notice my discomfort. He kept talking, telling me stories about his past relationships, about how hard it had been growing up feeling like he didn't fit in. At first, I thought he was just trying to connect, to make me feel less alone. But then he started mentioning details that made me wonder, the way he described certain people, the way he phrased things, the subtle looks he gave me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. Was he hinting at something? Was he trying to tell me something without actually saying it? The next morning, we woke up early and went hiking. The trail was narrow and winding, surrounded by thick trees that blocked most of the sunlight. Daniel walked slightly ahead of me, occasionally pausing to wait for me to catch up. He pointed out birds, wildflowers, things I wouldn't have noticed on my own. He was patient, kind, almost fatherly at times. But then other times, he would reach out and gently push branches aside so I could pass, his fingers grazing my arm longer than necessary. Or he'd stop suddenly and turn to face me, standing close enough that I could see the small lines around his eyes, the way his lips curved when he smiled. I tried to brush it off. Maybe I was reading too much into it. Maybe he was just being friendly. By the time we got back to the cabin, I was exhausted but strangely energized, like I had been caught in a current I couldn't escape. We made lunch together again, and this time, he sat across from me at the small wooden table, watching me eat with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You're really easy to talk to," he said after a while. "Most kids your age are either glued to their phones or barely speak unless they have to." I shrugged, not sure how to respond. He smiled again, that same intense smile from the night before. "It's nice having someone who listens," he added. I forced a smile back, but inside, I was starting to feel trapped. That evening, we sat by the fire pit outside, roasting marshmallows and drinking hot cocoa. The flames danced in the dark, casting long shadows across the ground. Daniel was quieter tonight, thoughtful in a way that made me nervous. After a while, he leaned back against a log and sighed. "You know," he said, "sometimes I wish I had someone like you when I was your age." I froze. "What do you mean?" I asked cautiously. He looked at me, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. "Someone who gets it. Someone who understands what it's like to feel different." I swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. He reached out and placed a hand on my knee. "You're special," he said softly. "Don't ever forget that." I didn't move. I didn't pull away. I just sat there, frozen, my mind racing with questions I couldn't ask out loud. Was this normal? Was I supposed to feel this way? Why was he saying these things to me? He removed his hand after a few seconds and leaned back again, like nothing had happened. "Come on," he said, standing up. "Let's go inside. It's getting late." I followed him without a word, my thoughts tangled and confused. Once inside, we sat on the couch, flipping through channels on the old TV. The room felt smaller now, like the walls were closing in. Daniel shifted closer to me, his shoulder pressing lightly against mine. "You okay?" he asked again, the same question from earlier but somehow heavier now. I nodded, even though I wasn't. I wasn't okay. I was starting to realize that something wasn't right, that this trip wasn't just about spending time with my uncle's friend. Something was happening, something I didn't know how to stop. And for the first time since arriving, I wished I was somewhere else, anywhere else, far away from the fire crackling outside, far away from the man sitting beside me, far away from the feeling that I was already in too deep. The third day started like the others, but something had shifted. The air inside the cabin felt heavier, like a storm was brewing even though the sky outside was clear and blue. I woke up on the couch where I'd fallen asleep the night before, wrapped in a thin blanket that smelled faintly of pine and smoke. Daniel wasn't in the room, but I could hear him moving around in the kitchen, humming softly to himself. I sat up slowly, rubbing my eyes, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had settled in my chest. He turned when he heard me stir, his smile as warm as ever. "Morning," he said, holding out a mug of coffee. I hesitated for a second before taking it, unsure why I suddenly felt like I needed to be careful with every move I made. He watched me closely as I took a sip, like he was waiting for my reaction. I shrugged, not wanting to admit how true that was. He didn't seem to notice my hesitation. He just smiled again and said, "You didn't sleep well." We ate breakfast quietly, the only sound being the clinking of spoons against bowls. But then Daniel leaned back in his chair and studied me, his head tilted slightly like he was trying to figure me out. "You seem distant today," he said. I shrugged, not wanting to admit how true that was. He stood up and walked over to where I was sitting, placing his hands on the table on either side of me. "You know you can talk to me, right?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, but I couldn't meet his eyes. He stayed like that for a moment too long before stepping back and saying, "Come on, let's go for a walk." Outside, the sun was high, casting sharp shadows across the forest floor. We followed a narrow path that led deeper into the trees, the silence between us broken only by the occasional chirp of birds or the rustle of leaves in the wind. Daniel walked close beside me, close enough that our arms almost touched with every step. At one point, he reached out and brushed a branch aside so I could pass, his fingers grazing my shoulder longer than they should have. I flinched slightly but kept walking, pretending I hadn't noticed. We stopped near a small clearing, surrounded by tall pines that blocked out most of the sunlight. Daniel turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "You know," he said, "you don't have to pretend with me." I frowned, not understanding what he meant. "Pretend about what?" I asked cautiously. He stepped closer, closing the distance between us until there was barely any space left. "About how you feel," he said softly. My heart started pounding. I wanted to take a step back, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. "I don't know what you're talking about," I muttered, looking down at my shoes. He reached out and gently lifted my chin so I was forced to look at him. His eyes were intense, searching mine for something I didn't know how to give. "You do," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Then, without warning, he leaned in and kissed me. It was gentle at first, just a soft press of his lips against mine, but it sent a shock through my body that made me freeze completely. I didn't kiss him back. I didn't pull away. I just stood there, paralyzed, my mind screaming at me to do something while my body refused to obey. After a few seconds that felt like forever, he pulled back and looked at me, his expression unreadable. "I knew it," he murmured, almost to himself. Then he smiled, like he'd just won some kind of game. I stumbled backward, finally breaking free from whatever trance I'd been trapped in. "What are you doing?" I demanded, my voice shaking. He raised his hands in a placating gesture. Hey, calm down," he said, still smiling. "It's okay. You don't have to hide it from me." I shook my head violently. "No," I said, my voice stronger now. "This isn't okay. This shouldn't have happened." His smile faltered slightly, but he didn't look sorry. He looked satisfied. "Why are you acting like this?" he asked, tilting his head. "You've been giving me signs all weekend. The way you look at me, the way you open up to me." He trailed off, watching me closely. I felt like I was going to throw up. "I didn't mean anything by it," I snapped. "I thought we were just hanging out." "I didn't think." I cut myself off, unable to finish the sentence. Daniel sighed and took a step closer again, but I backed away quickly. "Don't," I warned, my voice trembling. He held up his hands again, but this time his smile was gone. All right, he said. "I'm sorry. I misread things. I thought there was something there." He sounded sincere, but I couldn't trust him anymore. Not after this. We walked back to the cabin in silence, the tension between us thick enough to cut with a knife. When we got inside, I went straight to the couch and sat down, wrapping my arms around myself as if I could somehow hold myself together. Daniel hovered nearby for a moment before disappearing into the bedroom, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I replayed the kiss over and over in my head, trying to make sense of it. Had I really given him signs? Was I somehow responsible for what had happened? The guilt twisted in my stomach, making me feel sick. I kept thinking about how I hadn't pushed him away sooner, how I just stood there like an idiot while he kissed me. Why hadn't I reacted faster? Why hadn't I screamed? By the time dinner rolled around, I couldn't eat. My appetite had vanished, replaced by a deep, gnawing fear that I couldn't shake. Daniel tried to act normal, cracking jokes and asking me questions about school, but I could tell he was forcing it. He kept watching me, waiting for me to say something, but I couldn't find the words. That night, I lay awake on the couch, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sound of Daniel breathing in the other room. I wanted to cry, but I was too afraid to make any noise. I felt trapped, like I was stuck in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. And worst of all, I didn't know how to get out. The next morning, I woke up with a heavy feeling in my chest, like I was carrying something I couldn't name. The cabin still smelled like pine and smoke, the same as it had since we arrived, but now it felt different, oppressive, like the walls were closing in on me. Daniel was already up, sitting at the small wooden table drinking coffee, his eyes lifting to meet mine when he heard me stir. He gave me a small smile, the kind that used to feel warm but now just made my stomach twist. "Morning," he he said, like nothing had changed. Like everything was normal. I didn't respond. I just grabbed a mug from the shelf and poured myself some coffee, even though I wasn't really thirsty. My hands were shaking slightly, so I clenched them around the warm ceramic, trying to steady myself. We ate breakfast in silence, the only sound being the occasional clink of silverware against plates. I could feel him watching me, waiting for me to say something, but I kept my head down, pretending to be focused on the food even though I barely tasted anything. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "You're still mad about last night," he said, more statement than question. I looked up at him then, my jaw tightening. "What do you think?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. He frowned, rubbing the back of his neck like he was trying to figure out how to fix this. "I told you I was sorry," he said gently. "I misread things. That's all. That's all," I repeated, my voice rising slightly. "You kissed me, Daniel. You don't get to pretend it didn't happen." He flinched at that, finally looking a little guilty. "I know," he admitted. "And I meant what I said. I thought there was something between us." Maybe not at first, but as the weekend went on, he trailed off, shaking his head. "I guess I got carried away. That was supposed to make me feel better, but it didn't. If anything, it made things worse. Because if he thought there was something between us, that meant he'd been watching me closely enough to believe that. He'd been paying attention to every little thing I did, interpreting it in a way that suited him. And I hadn't even realized it was happening. I pushed my plate away, suddenly not hungry anymore. "I want to go home," I said flatly. His eyes widened slightly, like he hadn't expected that. "Already?" he asked. "It's barely 10 o'clock. I nodded. "Yeah, I'm done here." He hesitated, then gave a small shrug. "All right," he said. "I'll call your uncle and let him know you're ready to come back early." He pulled out his phone and stepped outside to make the call, leaving me alone in the cabin. As soon as the door closed behind him, I stood up and started packing. I didn't care if I forgot something, I just wanted to get out of here. I shoved clothes into my bag, grabbed my phone and charger, and paced nervously while I waited for him to come back inside. When he returned, he looked almost disappointed. "He said he can pick you up in a couple hours," he told me. He's surprised, but okay with it. I nodded, not saying anything else. I didn't want to talk to him anymore. I didn't want to be near him. For the next 2 hours, we sat in awkward silence, both of us pretending to read or scroll through our phones, but neither of us really doing either. Every time I glanced at him, I saw something different, not the friendly, charming man who had picked me up a few days ago, but someone else entirely. Someone who had taken advantage of my trust, who had made me feel confused and unsafe. When my uncle finally arrived, I was already standing by the door with my bag slung over my shoulder. Daniel opened the door before I could, greeting my uncle with a tight smile. "Everything good?" my uncle asked, glancing between the two of us. I nodded quickly. "Yeah, just needed to get back." My uncle looked at me like he wanted to ask more, but he didn't. Instead, he just said, "All right, let's go." I didn't look back as I walked past Daniel. I didn't say goodbye. I just climbed into the car and buckled my seatbelt, staring straight ahead as my uncle backed out of the driveway. The drive home was quiet. My uncle tried making small talk at first, asking about the trip, about how the cabin was, if I had fun. I gave short answers, mostly shrugs and vague responses. After a while, he stopped trying. When we got back to my house, I grabbed my bag and mumbled a thank you before heading inside. My mom greeted me from the kitchen, asking if I wanted something to eat, but I just shook my head and went straight to my room. Once I was inside, I shut the door and collapsed onto my bed, burying my face in my pillow. I didn't cry, I couldn't. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything over and over again in my head. Trying to make sense of it. Trying to understand what had gone wrong. But the truth was, nothing had gone wrong, not from Daniel's perspective, anyway. From his point of view, maybe he really believed there was something between us. Maybe he thought I had led him on. And that terrified me, because it meant he wouldn't see what he did as wrong. It meant he wouldn't feel guilty. It meant I was the only one who knew how messed up this whole thing was. Over the next few days, I withdrew completely. I stopped answering messages from friends, skipped going out with people I usually hung out with, and barely spoke to my family. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, felt his lips on mine, remembered the way he looked at me like I belonged to him somehow. I started questioning everything: why I had agreed to go on the trip, why I hadn't said no sooner, why I hadn't screamed or run away. I hated myself for not reacting faster, for letting it happen. I felt dirty, like something had been taken from me that I couldn't get back. I wanted to tell someone. I wanted to scream it to the world. But every time I tried to form the words, they stuck in my throat. What if no one believed me? What if they thought I was lying? What if they said I had asked for it? So I stayed silent. I buried the pain deep inside me, hoping it would fade with time. But it didn't. It only grew heavier, like a weight I couldn't shake. And slowly, I started changing. I became more withdrawn, more guarded. I avoided spending time with male adults, especially anyone close to my family. I stopped trusting easily. I started seeing danger where there wasn't any, jumping at sudden movements, flinching when someone touched me unexpectedly. My uncle noticed eventually. One evening, he knocked on my door and asked if we could talk. I didn't want to, but I couldn't say no. He sat on the edge of my bed, looking at me carefully. "You've been acting different," he said softly. "Is everything okay?" I stared at my hands, twisting them together nervously. "I don't know," I muttered. He waited patiently, giving me space to speak if I wanted to. But I couldn't. Not yet. So I just shrugged and said, "Just school stuff. Stress." He nodded like he understood, but I could tell he didn't believe me. Still, he didn't push. He just patted my leg and said, "Let me know if you ever want to talk, all right?" I nodded, even though I knew I never would. Because how do you explain something like this? How do you tell someone that someone they trusted crossed a line that shouldn't have existed in the first place? And most importantly, how do you make them believe you? Because I knew, deep down, that if I told the truth, I might not be believed. And that scared me more than anything else. It took years before I could even say the words out loud. Years of pretending everything was fine. Years of waking up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat from dreams I couldn't control. Years of avoiding certain places, certain people, especially men who reminded me of him. I built walls around myself so high that even I didn't know how to tear them down. By the time I got to college, I thought I had moved past it. I told myself I was stronger. Now, that what happened was just a bad memory I could leave behind. But memories don't disappear just because you want them to. They linger. They wait for moments when you're quiet, when your mind is alone with itself, and then they creep back in like shadows stretching across a wall. I made friends, good ones. People who laughed at my jokes, who stayed up late talking about life and dreams and stupid things we wanted to do after graduation. One of them, Sarah, became someone I trusted more than most. She wasn't the type to pry, but she had this way of listening that made you feel safe. Like whatever you said, she wouldn't judge you for it. One night, after a long day of classes and too much coffee, we were sitting on her dorm room floor eating cheap pizza and scrolling through our phones when she looked at me and asked, "Have you ever been in love?" I froze. The question seemed simple enough, but something about the way she said it made my stomach twist. I shrugged, trying to play it off. "Not really," I said. "I mean, I've liked people. Crushes, whatever." She tilted her head slightly, studying me. "What about something serious? Something real?" I hesitated. Then I shook my head. "Not really." My voice sounded flat, even to me. She didn't press me, but I could tell she didn't believe me. And honestly, neither did I. That conversation stuck with me longer than I expected. It made me think about why I had never let anyone get close to me. Why I always found reasons to pull away before things got too deep. Was it just fear of getting hurt? Or was it something else? The next week, I was walking back to my dorm after class when I saw a flyer taped to a bulletin board outside the student center. It read, "Free counseling services available, you are not alone." I stared at it for a long time. I had seen those kinds of flyers before, ignored them without a second thought. But something about that one felt different. Like it was meant for me. I ended up making an appointment the next day. Sitting in that small office, surrounded by soft lighting and bookshelves filled with psychology textbooks, I realized how hard this was going to be. The therapist was kind, older, with warm eyes and a calm voice. She introduced herself, offered me water, and then asked the same question everyone always did. "So, what brings you here today?" I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. I tried again. Still nothing. She waited patiently, not pushing, just watching me struggle with the weight of my own silence. Finally, I whispered, "There's something I've never told anyone." She nodded. "Whenever you're ready." And so I started talking. At first, it was slow. I stumbled over words, skipped details, avoided the parts that hurt the most. But as the minutes passed, the floodgates cracked open. I told her about the trip. About Daniel. About how he kissed me, how he made me feel confused and trapped, how I blamed myself for not stopping it sooner. I told her how I had carried that secret for years, how it shaped the way I saw people, how it made me afraid of being touched, of being close to anyone. I told her how guilty I felt for not saying no loudly enough, for not fighting harder, for letting it happen at all. And then, for the first time since it happened, someone listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't ask if I was sure. She didn't question my version of events or make excuses for him. Instead, she leaned forward slightly and said, "You did nothing wrong." Those 4 words hit me like a wave. I hadn't realized how badly I needed to hear them until they were spoken aloud. "You were manipulated," she continued gently. "He used your trust against you. That's not your fault." Tears welled up in my eyes, but I didn't try to stop them. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't alone in this anymore. Over the next few months, I went back every week. We talked about boundaries, about power dynamics, about how predators often target vulnerable people, gaining their trust before crossing lines they should never have come near. She helped me understand that what happened wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was abuse, emotional manipulation, a violation of trust. And I wasn't weak for not fighting back. I was young, confused, afraid. I began to heal. Slowly, I started opening up to Sarah, too. At first, I only told her bits and pieces, testing how she would react. But when I finally told her everything, she didn't hesitate. She pulled me into a hug and said, "I'm so sorry that happened to you." Hearing that, hearing someone care, meant more than I could explain. Eventually, I knew there was one more person I needed to talk to. My uncle. We met for coffee one weekend, just the 2 of us. He looked surprised when I asked to speak to him alone, but he agreed without asking questions. We sat in silence for a moment before I finally spoke. "Remember that trip?" I asked quietly. His expression shifted. He nodded slowly. "Yeah." I took a deep breath. "Something happened while I was there." His brow furrowed. "With Daniel." I nodded. "He kissed me." The words hung in the air between us. For a second, he didn't move. Then his face hardened, his jaw tightening. "What?" he asked, his voice low. I repeated it, forcing myself to say it clearly. "Daniel kissed me. He made me feel like it was okay. Like maybe I wanted it. But I didn't. I never wanted any of it." My uncle stared at me for a long time, his hands gripping the edge of the table like he was trying to hold himself together. Finally, he exhaled sharply and ran a hand through his hair. "I had no idea," he said, almost to himself. "I swear, if I had known." "I know," I interrupted. "That's why I never told you. I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't want you to feel responsible." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes I hadn't expected: guilt. Anger. Sadness. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have protected you." I shook my head. "You didn't know." But he still looked devastated. "I should have known." We sat there for a while, the silence heavy but not uncomfortable. Just 2 people trying to process something neither of us could change. After that day, things between us changed. Not in a bad way, in a better way. He started checking in on me more. Asking how I was doing. Making sure I wasn't carrying the weight of everything alone. And I kept going to therapy. Kept talking. Kept healing. Because secrets only protect the people who do harm. And I was done protecting him. I was done letting what happened define me. I used to think healing was something that happened all at once, like a sudden moment where everything just clicked and I felt whole again. But it wasn't like that. Healing was slow. It came in pieces, like puzzle parts one had to find scattered inside myself, sometimes buried so deep I didn't even know they were missing. It started with therapy. Week after week, I kept showing up, even when it hurt. Even when I left the office feeling more broken than when I walked in. Talking about what happened wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I learned that my feelings were valid, every single one of them. That confusion didn't mean consent. That silence didn't mean permission. And most importantly, that I hadn't done anything wrong. There were days when the pain still felt fresh, like I had gone backward instead of forward. Nights when I woke up gasping from dreams that weren't really dreams, just memories pretending to be. But slowly, those moments became less frequent. The weight on my chest got lighter. I started sleeping through the night again. I smiled without thinking about whether or not it was real. I also started rebuilding trust, in people, and more importantly, in myself. I realized I had been blaming myself for years, carrying guilt that wasn't mine to carry. I thought if I had just said no louder, if I had pushed him away harder, if I had run out of that cabin the second things felt wrong, then maybe none of it would have happened. But the truth is, none of that matters. Because no matter how I reacted, what he did was wrong. No matter how confused I was, no matter how much he made me question myself, I never gave him permission to cross that line. And that's the thing abusers count on: our silence, our self-doubt, our fear of not being believed. They know that we'll blame ourselves before we ever blame them. They know we'll stay quiet because speaking up feels impossible, like jumping headfirst into a storm we might not survive. But here's what I've learned: survivors do survive. We may not come out unscathed, but we come out stronger. We learn to recognize red flags. We learn to set boundaries. We learn that our voices matter, even when we feel small. Writing this story wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about dragging someone's name through the mud or seeking attention. It was about taking back my power. About making sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to someone else. About letting other people who have gone through similar things know they aren't alone. Because I know there are others out there right now, sitting in silence, wondering if they're crazy for feeling unsafe. Wondering if their experience counts because they didn't scream loud enough, fight hard enough, cry loudly enough. Wondering if anyone will believe them if they speak up. To those people, I want to say this: your silence doesn't mean you agreed. Your fear doesn't mean you asked for it. Your confusion doesn't mean it was your fault. You deserve to feel safe. You deserve to be heard. And you deserve to heal. I'm not perfect. I still have bad days. Sometimes I get reminded of things I wish I could forget. But I keep moving forward. I keep talking. I keep choosing to live, not just exist. And every time I speak, every time I share, every time I write, I feel a little freer. If you're listening to this and you've been through something like this, or even something different but just as painful, please know that help is out there. Therapy changed my life. Friends who truly care changed my life. Speaking up changed my life. You don't have to go through this alone. If you found strength in hearing my story, I'd love to hear yours too. If not now, then maybe later, when you're ready. Just remember, your voice matters. Your story matters. And healing is possible, even when it feels impossible. Thank you for listening. If this resonated with you, please consider liking and subscribing so you don't miss future stories like this. Drop a comment below. I read every single one. Remember, you're not alone. And you never have to walk through darkness forever. Take care of yourselves.